Wars aren't always decided by the biggest armies or the most advanced machinery. Sometimes, victory is held together with rusted bolts, scavenged parts, and the determination of ordinary people who refuse to bow. During the Second World War, when occupiers swept across Europe and stripped civilians of weapons, tools, and freedom, something remarkable happened. Across villages, cities, mountains, and farms, resistance fighters turned sheds, barns, and scrap piles into armories. They built weapons not from factories, but from whatever their hands could find. Scrap metal, bicycle frames, broken tools, old kitchenware things. Most people would toss away became instruments of survival, sabotage, and rebellion. These handmade weapons weren't just tools of war. They were living proof that ingenuity can rise even in the darkest times. When rifles were seized and ammunition disappeared from civilian hands, people didn't give up, they adapted. On farms and in rural towns, blacksmiths reawakened ancient craft. They sharpened scythes into long polearms and forged sickles into curved blades meant for ambush. Farmers turned hay hooks and heavy hammers into melee weapons. Even the humble entrenching shovel carried by soldiers on every front was sharpened and shaped into a brutal close combat tool capable of splitting bone in a single strike. In places like rural France, pruning shears and hidden sickles became silent weapons used to disable guards or ambush patrols under cover of night. These weren't elegant tools, but in the cramped stairwells of old towns, on forest paths, or in the shadows of ruined buildings, they were effective. They remind us today that tools meant for hard labor can become formidable defensive instruments when reinforced, weighted, and properly handled. But improvised weapons weren't limited to farmsteads. In occupied Poland, the Home Army created one of the most astonishing examples of wartime innovation. The WWII submachine gun, built largely from scavenged bicycle parts, plumbing pipes, and leftover steel. It was assembled in secret workshops, hidden beneath homes and barns places, where discovery meant execution. Yet, under unimaginable pressure, these underground craftsmen succeeded. They turned scrap metal into fully functioning firearms, giving resistance fighters the firepower they desperately needed across Europe. Similar underground workshops sprang to life. Mechanics forged knives, bayonets, and grenade casings out of junkyard metal. Springs from broken cars became firing mechanisms. Even rusted tubes were reborn as makeshift shotgun barrels. These creations weren't perfect, but perfection wasn't the goal, functionality was. And that principle remains true today. Scrap is never just scrap. Knowledge is the force that turns raw material into capability. For any survivalist, understanding basic metalworking or welding can turn a forgotten pile of steel into tools that matter. Some resistance groups didn't rely on weapons at all, they relied on sabotage. In occupied Czechoslovakia, where movement was restricted and firearms scarce, freedom fighters attacked infrastructure instead of soldiers, using stolen chemicals, scavenged fuses, and everyday supplies. They built improvised explosives designed to derail trains, destroy supply routes, and disrupt factories. In one of history's most daring operations, Operation Anthropoid, operatives, trained by the British, used a homemade grenade to attack Reinhard Heydrich, one of the highest-ranking Nazi officials. The device wasn't a standard-issue weapon. It was a combination of factory parts and improvised additions, crafted in secrecy. Yet it changed the course of resistance history. This teaches a vital lesson. Sometimes disruption is more powerful than direct confrontation. When resources are limited, knowledge of chemistry, mechanics, and patience can shift the balance more than sheer force ever could. Further south, Yugoslav partisans waged one of the most difficult guerrilla wars of the conflict. Encircled by German and Italian forces, they relied almost entirely on what they could build or salvage. Villagers donated scrap iron, nails, broken tools, anything that could be reforged. Blacksmiths created spears, axes, and long knives. Deep in the forests, hidden workshops manufactured hand grenades packed with fertilizer-based explosives. They built crude but deadly mines, triggered by pressure or tripwires. They dug pits lined with sharpened stakes and placed them along patrol routes. Rolling carts, stripped of wheels and filled with explosives, became mobile traps. launched downhill toward enemy columns. These improvised designs slowed down heavily armed occupiers and gave partisans the chance to strike on their own terms. And their approach still holds meaning today. In survival scenarios, planning and creativity often outweigh raw firepower. A well-designed trap or alarm can be more valuable than a weapon you don't have. Silence was another weapon. Resistance fighters knew that noise brought reinforcements, so they often relied on blades rather than bullets. Modified axes, sharpened spades, and rugged knives forged from file, steel, or car springs became essential tools. In Denmark, resistance groups quietly developed what were known as death knives, forged in secret workshops and disguised as harmless tools to evade inspection. Their purpose was singular: one silent, decisive strike. These handmade blades remind us that weapons requiring no ammunition, no complex maintenance, and no sound can be among the most reliable tools in emergencies. Today, a machete, an axe, or a simple sharpened spade has far more potential than most people imagine. Of course, no conversation about improvised weapons is complete without the Molotov cocktail, the simplest and most iconic tool of resistance. First made famous during the Winter War by Finnish soldiers who used them against Soviet armor, this glass batal incendiary became a symbol of defiance across Europe. Easy to build, easy to deploy, and devastating in tight urban environments. The Molotov was stockpiled by resistance groups from Poland to France to the Balkans. While modern laws restrict their construction, the underlying lesson remains: controlled fire is one of humanity's oldest and most effective tools. Understanding fuel, ignition, and fire management is a fundamental survival skill, one that requires knowledge, not a factory. In the end, the homemade weapons of World War II tell a story far bigger than the objects themselves. They reflect resilience, creativity, courage, and the unbreakable will of ordinary people who refuse to be powerless. Farmers, mechanics, blacksmiths, and laborers, people who had never set foot on a battlefield, became engineers of survival. They transformed shovels, scrap metal, pipes, nails, bottles, and even bicycles into tools that shaped history. They proved that when resources vanish, skill and mindset rise to take their place. For anyone who studies preparedness today, these lessons are timeless. A shovel can be more than a shovel. A workshop can be more than a storage shed. Scrap metal is never just waste. Knowledge and creativity are the true foundations of survival. And history shows us that sometimes the most impactful weapons aren't built in factories at all, but in backyards, barns, basements, and the determined minds of people who refuse to surrender. If you value history that teaches as much as it inspires, stay with us. Share this story with those who want to learn from the past. More lessons are waiting, lessons showing that even in humanity's darkest hours, ingenuity burns bright, and survival often belongs to those who can create something from nothing.